Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to just let everybody have a chance to join. We're watching the numbers as people are joining in here. Give it a minute or two, and then we'll get started. So thank you for coming. Okay. Well, good afternoon. My name is Andy Mueller. I'm the general manager here at the Colorado River District. I want to welcome you to one of our Water with Your Lunch series. It's been a little while since we had one, so we really appreciate everybody joining us this afternoon. Just a few minor housekeeping items to cover before I introduce our panel and then get into the substance of the discussion today. One, I want to just say, as we go through this discussion today, I'm going to give a brief, very basic 101 on the Colorado River and allocation of water in the Colorado River, a little bit of a discussion about what's driving the current shortage and crisis on the river. And then we're going to bring in our panelists and have a discussion among our panelists about their perspectives on both what's driving us to see this crisis on the river, but also potential fixes on the river. We'll cover a variety of issues in doing that. While we talk, we would welcome comments, questions from the audience through the Q&A button, which you can reach at the bottom of your screen. If you can type in your questions, we'll try to incorporate those into our discussion as we go. I can tell you, unfortunately, just due to the limited time we have, we may not get to all of those questions, but we'll sure try. And we appreciate, again, everybody being here. If for any reason someone can't stay for the whole thing or has technical problems, we will post a link and send it out to anybody who's registered. So you'll have that opportunity to watch this later. Share it with folks if you think it's that interesting. But we're very excited to have you here. Our panelists, if I can just tell you how excited we are to have Ann Castle, former Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Water and Science. And I think the experience she has is tremendous. She's currently associated with CU Boulder's Law School and the Water Center, Wilkinson-Getch's Water Center there. We're really fortunate to have Ann. She's from my perspective, one of the preeminent academic experts on the river today. She also brings a unique experience in being a water law practitioner here in the state of Colorado, covering some really important issues in our state and in the Big River during her career. We also have Steve Wolf with us today, the new executive director, and Steve, maybe general manager, I'm not sure what exactly the title is, down at the Southwestern Water Conservation District. Together with the Southwestern Water Conservation District, our district, those two districts cover the entire geography of Colorado's western slope. So Steve is new to his position, but not new to the river. He's worked in the Wyoming State Engineer's Office on interstate issues for Wyoming and specifically on Colorado River issues for quite a long time, and comes to us with great expertise, including his most recent position as the chair of the Upper Colorado River Commission's Engineering Committee. We're really fortunate to have such great panelists, and I'm really excited about the discussion today. If I can, as I said, I'm going to just provide a very basic, high-level discussion on what's going on the Colorado River. I apologize to any of you who are very experienced practitioners or policymakers on the river. It's a pretty basic intro, but we want to make sure that we reach as many people who are trying to learn about the Colorado River as possible. So it is a little bit basic. We'll try to get through that quickly so we can get into the meat of the discussion today with our panel. Just a very brief discussion. The Colorado River District, here's our 15 county area. We were formed back in 1937 to lead in the protection, conservation, use, and development of the water resources for the Colorado River Basin, and to assist our state in protecting Colorado's entitlement under the Colorado River Compact. We share those obligations with, again, the Southwestern Water Conservation District that Steve Wolf leads. If I can, I want to talk right now just about the flows in the river. And I apologize for the graphs. Frankly, as I've said on these things before, having a lawyer talk about graphs is a sure way to A, screw up the data, and B, put people to sleep. But I think this graph is really illustrative of what's going on in the river. This is hydrologic data from 1875 to 2020. The data, just to be clear, from 1905 on is U.S. Bureau of Reclamation data, but from 1905 back to 1875 was reconstructed data that my predecessor, Eric Kuhn, and several folks here at the River District, including Dave Kanzer, put together. And what we believe is it really shows the better hydrology in the river and the variability that this river naturally has. This kind of light gray line that you see on the chart is the 10-year running average. And so you can really see that the high period in the 20s that during which the Colorado River Compact was executed. And you can see some of the low points in the 30s. Many of you have read about the Dust Bowl and the dry American West at that time. You see dry periods in the 70s. And again in the 2000s, and so we've got some extreme hydrologic variability that is common in the Colorado River. But I want to highlight right over here on the far right side, maybe by comparison, if you look at that red line, that's the running average to date. So that's from 1875 to 2020, and it shows that there's really, as of today, under 15 million acre feet of water on an average basis flowing in the Colorado River into Lake Powell. If you look at the last 20 years, however, that's this yellow line, and that's the 12.3 or 12.6 million acre feet that we've seen average year since 2020. Excuse me, since the year 2000. So that's that 20-year average. And it's really important to understand that that's a significant difference, right? The over 3 million acre foot difference. And what we're going to be talking about a lot today is what's driving that. From a water user's perspective or water allocation perspective, what does that mean, that 20 years of not having enough water or dealing with a low input into the system? The major reservoirs, Lake Powell and Lake Mead on the system, were designed to protect and provide, well, Lake Mead's purpose is to provide water to the Lower Basin, California, Arizona, and Nevada. Lake Powell's primary purpose is to protect Upper Basin users, and we'll get in briefly into why that's the case. If you just look at it right now to understand, those two major buckets that are each over 20 million acre feet are sitting below, with Lake Mead at 35% full and Lake Powell at 32% full. If you think about those in terms of a bank account, no one wants to see their bank account that low, and it's a really frightening situation in the Colorado River Basin. And it's important because there are over 40 million people who depend upon the Colorado River for its water, for their water supply. There's also 4 million acres of very productive irrigated agriculture in the basin that depends upon those flows. The population centers that depend on the Colorado River include cities like Grand Junction, Phoenix, and Tucson that are located within the basin. It also includes San Diego, LA, that metroplex over there, the Wasatch Front in Utah in terms of Salt Lake City and Provo, the entire Colorado Front Range with cities going from Greeley all the way down to Pueblo, and in between Denver, Aurora, and Colorado Springs. It also includes Albuquerque. So you can see the large population centers in the Southwest truly depend upon this river system as their lifeblood. To just put it very simply, Most of the water in the Colorado River system comes from the upper basin. About 70% comes from the western slope of Colorado in an average year. That can vary year to year, but in an average year, about 70% comes from within the Colorado River District and the Southwestern Water Conservation District boundaries. So it really is a very productive zone that we happen to live in and operate in here at the River District and at Southwestern. Obviously the supply of water, about 90% from the upper basin and about 90% of the people down in the lower basin. To understand a little bit, and again, very high level. So those of you who study this and write about it on a regular basis, as I said, I apologize if I'm a little too basic for you today, but it's really important to understand under the 1922 compact and some of the subsequent agreements, what's going on there. The lower basin was allocated under Article 3A. The first 7.5 million acre feet of water, and there are lots of qualifications on that. So we'll just state that another 7.5 million acre feet were allocated to the upper basin under Article 3A. Article 3B attributes another million acre feet to the lower basin, and it's our position and understanding from looking at historic documents that here at the River District, we believe that was specifically aimed at tributary use or tributary production, primarily in Arizona and the Gila and Salt rivers. And then there's another 1.5 million acre feet allocated to Mexico. Now, in 1922, there wasn't a treaty with Mexico, so it just reserved a placeholder for the Mexican allocation. The 1940s agreement or treaty with Mexico established their right to 1.5 million acre feet of water and gave them that priority. Importantly, that water was to be provided out of the surplus beyond those allocations under Article 3A and 3B, unless there was a shortage on the river, at which point it would be allocated 1/2 each to the upper and lower basin. What exactly constitutes the shortage is the subject matter of lots of disagreement in that context. What's actually happening on the river in terms of river use? The upper basin on an average year uses between 4 and 4.5 million acre feet. Right. Remember, their compact allocation in the upper basin is actually 7.5 million acre feet. So well below what was allocated on paper. The lower basin uses their main stem users use a full 7.5 that they were allocated under Article 3A. Mexico uses in most years 1.5 million acre feet. There have been times where they haven't recently, and there have been really creative agreements to work with that. But the lower basin also has use in their tributaries somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million acre feet that they consume. And there's another 1 to 1.5 million acre feet. And this slide says reservoir evaporation, and I'll get into that a little bit more. It's more than that, but more than reservoir evaporation in the lower basin. So you can see numbers that vastly exceed the original treaty going on down in the lower basin. Well, what is it that's happening down there? And what's the question for us today is what's driving the river into crisis? And I think we have to look at two issues. So I'm going to cover overuse first in the lower basin, and then secondly, the supply issue that's occurring throughout the basin, but particularly in the upper basin. Annual lower basin overuse is a thing that we in the upper basin have been talking with in the 7-state context for a long time. There's significant evaporation off of large federal reservoirs in the lower basin that isn't accounted for in their consumptive use. Whereas in the upper basin, the evaporation off of Lake Powell and Flaming Gorge, Navajo, and Blue Mesa, those major federal reservoirs, are in fact counted as consumptive use in the upper basin. So when we look at that 4 to 4.5 million acre feet of consumptive use in the upper basin, it includes our evaporation off those federal reservoirs. In the lower basin, that use, the 7.5 million acre feet does not include that. It's not within that, contained within that. There are also transit losses. So deliveries from Lake Mead are ordered by the contractors down in the lower basin, the major water users down there. And when they order it from Lake Mead, they release it. But where the water is measured is where it's picked up in their point of diversion on the Colorado River. So the system is absorbing the transit losses, which can be really significant during hot, dry periods of the year. And then there's system losses, right? So there are times, although less today than there used to be, but there still are times where contractees in the lower basin order water deliveries, and for one reason or another are unable to pick those up at their head gate. Hydrologic conditions have changed, or other circumstances have occurred, and when they bypass that water, that water, it does not get attributed to their consumptive use. So it's ordered but not delivered water. There's also the question of lower basin tributary consumption without contributing to the Mexico deliveries. Right now, the deliveries to Mexico are almost exclusively coming out of or being booked to Lake Mead. And that matters to all of us because of the way those two reservoirs, Mead and Powell, are operated. And then there's water that's used for releases related to the multi-species system conservation program. And that water is also not usually attributed as consumptive use in the lower basin. And that, from our perspective, is also a problem. There are also inefficiencies associated with Arizona groundwater storage of Colorado River water. They divert it. Is it a beneficial use? Arizona certainly says it is. Some of us in the upper basin question that. But nonetheless, there's an inefficiency in their ability to pull it out later. And so is that consumptive use that should be accounted for? Bottom line is it's well over 1 to 1.3 million acre feet annually. We can have much better science in terms of what all of those add up to, but it's a really significant amount of water. And if you go back and look at the total water balance that currently exists in Mead and Powell, just over the last 10 years, if you take the low end of that, we have 11 million acre feet of additional water in the system had the overuse been addressed. So it's certainly a concern from those of us in the upper basin. Something that concerns everybody in the American Southwest, frankly, is climate change and increasing temperatures. Again, remember, the upper basin has the 90% of the water production in the basin. You can see in this map, this is a map that shows temperature change between 1895 and 2018. It's produced from NOAA data, but the graphic itself was a Washington Post graphic. They're kind enough to let us use that graphic for discussions like this. The darker the color, the bigger the rise in temperatures over that 100+ year period of time. So you can see in the water production zones in Utah and Colorado, certainly within our district, you're seeing really large increases in temperature. Some of our counties have temperature increases over that period of time of well over 4.2 degrees. And why does that matter? It's not by the way, a political statement from me. It's a fact that we've seen that temperature increase. We've seen our growing season get longer. We've seen days that are above 90 degrees grow tremendously, increase over that period of time. And we've also seen low temperatures steeply climb as well during that same period of time. So it is happening. We know it's occurring, but why do we care from a water supply perspective? Bottom line is, for every 1 degree Fahrenheit rise in temperature, we're seeing stream flow in the Colorado River system be reduced somewhere between 3 to 8%. That 8% number comes from recent science that the USGS did. It is, I think, it's a range in there somewhere. bottom line is we have seen and we should expect to continue to see decreasing flows in a system that's already stressed. What does all this amount to? It amounts to a year like this, where we've had really poor hydrology, so poor snowpack in the upper basin. We've had extremely hot temperatures and really dry soil conditions, and leading into last winter. And what that means is, for those of us in the upper basin, where we don't live and our systems don't operate below large federal reservoirs, years like this mean, for projects like the one in Steve's territory, in the Dolores project, their consumptive use of water has completely decreased, if not stopped, within the Dolores project, for instance. It means that many of our upper sub-basin ranchers and farmers who are on direct flow ditches don't have any water to divert. So we're taking shortages on a regular basis in the upper basin, just based on hydrology. Some of our systems, the Uncompahgre system and the Grand Valley system, for instance, in Colorado, do have some reservoir storage above them, and so they are able to continue to produce. But overall, that availability of water and the consumption of water in most of our systems in Western Colorado is greatly decreased in a year like this. So our ranchers, certainly our high country ranchers and farmers, are used to taking shortages on a regular basis. And we're unfortunately during the last 22 years, we've seen a number of our operations have to cull their herd year after year because there's just not enough water to support the cattle, or to grow the feed to support the cattle. We've seen increasingly difficult economic situations for our producers in our area. So it's a real problem. And so the question that we're addressing today with the panel is, well, what can be done to bring the river back into balance? What is being done, and how do we address that? And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now, provided I can figure out how to do that, and bring Steve and Ann up. If you guys would turn on your cameras and join me. Rather than myself talk about what's going on, I want to get the real experts we've invited. Again, thank you very much for both being willing to be here and talk to our crowd. We'll note that for those of you attending, we have about 230 people on the call. So if we aren't able to get to your questions today, I apologize. But I just want you to know that we are doing our best. I want to turn right now to some questions for Steve and Ann, and really focus, if I can. Maybe an opening question is just, in your opinion, what's the single biggest threat to the Colorado River and the communities throughout the 7 states and Mexico that rely on its water? And I'd open that up to Ann first, and maybe Steve following. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me, and hi, everybody. It's nice to be able to talk to all of the people who are interested in the Colorado River, and I know there are a lot of subject matter experts on this conference as well. In terms of the biggest single threat, it's our water balance. Last year and this year have been terrible. And that's not exactly a surprise, because it's exactly what has been predicted by the climate scientists. And Andy's, one of Andy's last slides alluded to that. We've seen Lake Powell drop 50 feet over the past year. That represents 4 million acre feet of stored water that we don't have anymore in Lake Powell. And Powell is projected to hit the target level that we set of 25 feet of elevation. That target level was established there to protect hydropower generation and the upper basin's ability to comply with the compact. We're expected to hit that target level in 6 months, in February. so we're facing a very difficult problem right now. And I think that water balance, the decreases in supply that we've experienced in the 21st century that are squeezing the use of the Colorado River and depleting our savings account of stored water. That's our biggest problem. And if I could just add one thing to your explanation of the rules of the road, Andy,
Yes.
I think it's important to also point out that the compact does have a provision that the upper basin will not cause the flow of the river to be depleted below 75 million acre feet over 10 years. And that provision drives a lot of the discussion around how we deal with upper basin and lower basin compact compliance, and how we're going to operate the river. You know, we like to refer to that provision in the upper basin as a non-depletion obligation. The lower basin likes to refer to it as a delivery obligation. Some people will say it's a guarantee of 7.5 million acre feet a year that we'll send from the upper basin from Lake Powell. We don't like to hear about a guarantee, but actually that's what some of the early people involved in the compact and in compact negotiations call it, including our Colorado's Delph Carpenter called it a guarantee. Again, there's lots of legal theories about what that means, but it's an important provision that is going to drive a lot of the discussions.
Yeah, and you're so right to bring that up. And I think the real important issue with the non-depletion, we could spend all day talking about that, but understanding that the upper basin has a junior status to that lower basin delivery and that non-depletion obligation, which is hard to wrap your head around. But if you can think about the idea that and this gets into some technical issues, but there's also a provision in the compact that says that pre-existing rights shall not be impaired by the compact. So, you know, from an upper basin perspective, what that means is that rights that were prior use and perfected by use prior to the date of the compact when it was fully ratified, are not subject to the requirements under the non-depletion portion of the compact. Certainly, we understand that there's that is one area. Let me just say that of thousands in that little tiny document that is the Colorado River Compact that the lower basin and upper basin totally disagree on. Right. So it's a fairly simply written document, and unfortunately, it has lots of potential ambiguities in it. But our perspective in the upper basin is that our prior perfected rights, our pre-compact rights are no matter what's happening on the river, we're allowed to continue to divert those and use those. I think that rolling 10-year average is really important, Ann, that you bring up, and I think one of the things we should recognize is that today the upper basin is, according to the accounting that the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation keeps, has delivered about 92 million acre feet on that rolling 10-year average. So if our obligation is 75 million over 10, we're well over that obligation, and it continues to roll. The problem is that the system is operated in a way that you have Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and the continuing use in the lower basin has dropped Lake Mead, and our coordinated operating guidelines say that we need to deliver more water out of Powell to keep those reservoirs in approximately equal balance. That's why you'll note in that teacup diagram that Powell and Mead are both in the low 30s right now because of that coordinated operation guideline. And so the question is, though, you know, if we're at 92 million over 5, why is everybody talking about a crisis? Well, first of all, the rolling 10-year average includes some really productive years in 2011 and 2012 that are about to fall off the rolling 10-year average. And then if you look at the most recent projections by the Bureau, based on these coordinated reservoir operations, we're about to have 2, 3, maybe 4 years of deliveries at 7.48. So pretty quickly, we get down to around 82 million over 5, which is the number that the 82.5 million over 5 that the upper basin might owe if the if you include the Mexican obligation. If there's a shortage on the river and it's agreed that between the states and the feds that shortage is one that both upper and lower basin have to share, then our obligation becomes 82.5 million, right? So all of a sudden we're down at that level, and if we continue in poor hydrology, the upper basin could quickly be below that. Now, our analysis done by the River District and Southwestern and some of our other folks, we don't see a whole lot of risk of dropping below 75 over 10. But I have to say that given the hydrology this year and last year, and last several years, anything's possible on this river. And I think none of us should feel that we're operating without risk. But Steve, I want to give you a chance to answer that same question. So I think you have some interesting thoughts on it.
Well, thanks, Andy, and thanks to the River District for inviting me. And hi, Ann, it's good to see you. Sort of a lot to respond in there. First, Andy, thanks for addressing the pre-compact rights. I think that's an important point. And on the rolling 10-year average, you're right. I think it's going to be a big shock. I think at the end of 2020, we were at 92 million acre feet. When 2011 drops off at the end of 21, I think that drops to 88 million acre feet. So lost $4 million in that, or 4 million acre feet in that running average. Is going to be a big shock to some folks, I think. And importantly, that we're going to be seeing lower reservoir releases in the coming few years. Sort of back to the original question, both Andy in your intro and Ann in your comments, it is drought, it is climate change, it's poor hydrology, it's a system imbalance is that the threat we're seeing. But I do want to point out that regardless of what elevation Lake Powell or even Lake Mead is at, the water users and the producers in the upper basin suffer every year, regardless of what those elevations are, because we are so dependent on what Mother Nature brings in a snowpack each and every year. So a year like this, whether Lake Powell was full or half full or 1/3 full, our water users are suffering this year just because the water supply was not available to them at their head gates in the streams. So kind of important to keep that aspect in mind, I think.
Well, I definitely appreciate that. I want to, Steve, I appreciate your thoughts on that one. And I just want to maybe ask you a little bit. You've been working on Colorado River issues, interstate issues for many years. And I apologize for not knowing exactly how many decades that might be, but I am curious, in your opinion, how bad is this situation? And what does this year's pour inflow into Powell mean to your water users and our water users on the western slope? How does that impact them, and why should they be concerned?
Well, and yeah, I mean, we've talked about it's a bad year, it's a bad period we're in. I think part of that question is, why do we care about Powell so much? Powell does sit downstream of most of our water, really all of our water users. But we do need to keep in mind, Powell is important to the upper basin in 3 ways. First, obviously, it provides our savings account to deliver compact obligation water. Obviously a huge importance. Second importance, it generates a lot of hydropower that is used throughout the lower and upper basin, but it is important to a lot of the folks in the upper basin, just that cheap, reliable hydropower has been reliable. And thirdly, that hydropower generates a lot of money. That money, in at least parts of it, comes back to the upper basin. It allows for infrastructure repair and development. It provides money for endangered species compliance programs that allow a lot of water users to continue to operate, provides salinity control dollars. So Powell is important in a lot of aspects that we need to keep in mind. And I think that's why there's always such a focus and discussion about protection of Powell, protection of the 3525 elevation. It's hard for some people to understand that, looking at Powell so far downstream, but it is an important consideration in water management across the upper basin.
Yeah, I mean, I understand, Steve, on that power issue that the federal agency or WAPA, Western Area Power Administration, that's responsible for that is expecting to have an extra $92 million bill next year in order to continue to provide power, because when Powell is so low, the hydrologic head on the turbines is lower, and it's unable to produce the power, and they have to go out on the open market to produce power and provide it to the ratepayers or the electric users in the Upper Basin. And so many of our residents are not only being hit by drought and suffering the pain that comes with that, we're also going to see much higher electric bills, because that cost will get passed on to all of our electric customers. Many of our rural co-ops and others in the West use that power on an annual basis. So it really is, you're right, a really important part of this discussion. Would I have to point out, from a water supply perspective, the primary purpose of Powell is to protect Upper Basin consumptive uses. Its primary purpose is not to produce electricity, but we have to recognize, though, the importance of that electricity. If I can maybe turn, if each of you, and Ann, I'd love to hear your thoughts maybe first. Can you talk about what you think is how we can best bring the river back into balance? And how do we do that? What do we do here?
Well, so bringing the river into balance is adjusting supply and demand to meet each other, right? And I mean, that's obvious, but we don't have much control over the supply. And so the thing that we have our fingers on the lever of is demand. And, it's just like a checking account. The water balance is the inflows and outflows. And if you have a savings account, you can weather fluctuations in your inflows and keep outflows at the same level. But if on average your outflows are bigger than your inflows, the savings is going to be depleted, and you got a problem. And that's where we find ourselves right now. And so overall, I think we have to think about reducing demand overall in the system. And, it's not like that hasn't happened already. The lower basin water users have reduced their demand, even acknowledging all the numbers that you put up, Andy, with respect to overuse in the lower basin. We've had pilot projects in Colorado and Wyoming in particular on demand management that have shown the feasibility of reducing demand. But we obviously have more to do, because we lost 4 million acre feet in Lake Powell in the past 12 months. And so we just have to balance the system better. And it's a really complex system of management. It's negotiated over a century by really smart people. And because it's a complex web, when you modify one component, it's like putting your finger on a spider web where everything else starts to ripple. And that's why any discussion about changing the rules of the system has to be inclusive, because we need to understand how tweaking one rule here or there is going to ripple through and impact water users and sectors of the economy. And, I wanted to just mention that everybody's got a different perspective on how the system works, how the compact ripples through. And you talked about, from the Upper Basin perspective, we see the Lower Basin as overusing. We seem to be asked in the Upper Basin to bear the entire burden of climate change because of that 75 million over 10-year provision in the compact. And that grates against us, because we're using around 4 million acre feet when we've been raised from the cradle to believe that we have 7.5 million acre feet to develop even though that's not exactly what the compact says. And we think the lower basin is overusing and causing all this stress on the system. But the lower basin has issues too. And from their perspective, they're not overusing. They're doing exactly what the compact and the rules allow. And they've made reductions in their usage from about 7.5 million acre feet down to 6.8. And from the lower basin's perspective, we in the upper basin don't have a plan yet. We don't really have a plan for drought response from the upstream reservoirs, even though that's happening now. We're making releases from the upstream reservoirs, but the feds initiated that. And we don't have a plan for demand management. So everybody's got their grievances and their legal theories. And as our friend and colleague John Fleck has said, there's not enough water for all the lawyers to be right. And I'd add a corollary to that. There's not enough water for any of the lawyers to be right 100%. So we've got to figure out how we're going to equitably allocate this burden of reduced flows. And that means using less water.
I think that's an excellent point, Ann, and maybe Steve, if you want to provide your thoughts on that.
Well,
how do we?
In respect to a lot of our lower basin colleagues, we have heard from them that they believe, at least some of them, they believe the entire burden of climate change should not be on the upper basin. So we've heard that in conversation. So I need to acknowledge that. I think that's fair. And you talked about the demand side, and you're right on. We have to always look for ways to manage our demand, to reduce our demands. I think on the supply side, there are some things we can look at too that can help. All the upper basin states do weather modification programs. I think they can provide benefits at times. Those benefits will really typically only show up in years when we have snowstorms, we have storms coming through. So they're not going to help us every year. Secondly, people talk about storage all the time. I'm not sure we're ever going to see any big storage projects built in the upper basin, but I think there are opportunities to look forward to build smaller storage projects, not to bring on new uses, but try and help us get through those dry periods. And thirdly, I think the most critical one I really think we need to look at as far as water supply is the whole concept of forest health, watershed health. I think we can do a lot of management on our forest, provide wildfire mitigation, which is a big one. And also, if we have healthier forests, I think generally we're going to be able to generate a little more water off those forests. They won't be, some of these old growth things that have not burned in a while are too mature. There are opportunities, small opportunities localized to provide some, I'll call them new supplies or increased supplies. So I think we need to look at both supply and demand side.
Okay, I think that's great, and I do, Ann, I think your point on water conservation is a good one. I agree. It's really an unpopular statement among kind of the historic water policy folks in the upper basin to acknowledge that water conservation is something that we in the upper basin need to do in addition to the lower basin. I think I gave a pretty good explanation of our perspective on lower basin overuse. I wanted to say that the reason that there are differences of agreement or of opinion is that there is the compact allocates a number, but that number between the states, that 7.5 in the lower basin, was actually decided by the Supreme Court in an Arizona v. California case, which actually interpreted the Boulder Canyon Project Act that created Lake Mead and the Hoover Dam, and it really wasn't interpreting the compact, but it still allocated the entire 7.5 million to each state without taking into account all of those system losses that I identified, or all those overuse areas. And so that's just so people understand, that's where that conflict arises from, really, is maybe to Ann's point, and even John Fleck's point, is that when you have lawyers doing math, it doesn't actually come out right. So that's true at our highest level of our judiciary, apparently, as well. So I think that it's important to recognize that. And I do appreciate the fact, as Ann points out, that the lower basin has entered into a series of agreements, and most recently the drought contingency plan that documents that were agreed to between the 7 states in 2018 and codified into federal law. Actually, one of the fastest pieces of legislation that I saw go through Congress and the White House during the Trump administration. It was really an amazing bipartisan push that stood out as an example of cooperation. In that agreement, the Lower Basin agreed to take very significant cuts in water use depending upon the level of Lake Mead. And so as the lake drops, there's bigger conservation efforts in the Lower Basin. And I think everybody in the system should applaud that, but recognize that number only approaches the 1.3 million that we believe is overuse when Lake Mead is at its lowest point. And therefore that system conservation that they're engaging in is keeping, and it's designed, unfortunately, with a flaw that keeps the entire system in a crisis, right? So we'd like to see the Lower Basin conserve water in that quantity every year. I think the Lower Basin would like to see us conserve water and contribute more water into the system every year. And so, how do we do that? I think within our state in Colorado, we've got some perverse incentives right now that you have to use your water or fear losing it. And while we have a few statutory exceptions to that have grown up in the last decade, we probably need to focus more on those kind of solutions to really encourage that conservation among all of our water users. And I know our district and others spend a lot of time and a lot of money on our ag areas, agricultural production, trying to help put in water conservation and water efficiency measures in both off-farm deliveries and on-farm water applications to try to help the agricultural sector use less water. And I think it's really critical that we continue to gain momentum. And it's one of the things I have to say, I'm excited about the infrastructure bill going through Congress right now. There's a lot of money in that for Western water. And I think it's a really exciting opportunity to help on that water conservation side within our agricultural and municipal side. But I wanted to ask Ann, we can't have a conversation about this without talking about the inequities present in tribal drinking water. And Ann, you've really done a lot of work on that area. And I thought maybe if you could just explain a little bit of the work you and frankly, our federal government, the senators from our state and others are really pushing right now. I'd love to hear your thoughts and explanations to what's happening there.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andy. This issue came to the forefront a little over a year ago when there was a lot of press around the disproportionate incidence of COVID on reservations. A lot of press focused on the Navajo Nation, but other places as well, where the incidence of COVID was 3.5 to 4 to 5 times greater than in the general population. And then there was some scientific work done correlating that higher incidence of disease to lack of access to clean water. There's a lot of data on again, disproportionate access to clean water on reservations. By some estimates, almost half of all households on reservations lack indoor plumbing, which could be water, could be sanitation, but a significant number of tribal households either don't have piped water to the house, or if there is piped water, it's of inadequate quality for drinking. Or they might have a system that is aging, deteriorating, no longer reliable, subject to contamination. So there's a variety of different ways in which lack of access to clean water can occur, but they are just denser on tribal reservations than in the rest of the communities. And it's interesting, the lack of access to water is more correlated to race than it is to rural location, which is surprising and very unfortunate. So a small group through the Colorado River Water and Tribes Initiative has started to really focus on this issue, to bring attention to the problem, to educate people about it, because you know, so many of us are surprised to learn that our neighbors on reservations don't have piped water to their houses. We think of that as a third world problem, and it's not. It's not limited to that. So we wanted to educate, but we also wanted to make a difference on the ground. And Senator Bennett, Senator Hickenlooper, Senator Heinrich from New Mexico, and Senator Warren have introduced a bill that would provide for full funding for the Indian Health Services Sanitation Facilities Construction Program. That's the arm of the Indian Health Service that builds water systems and gets pipes to houses. And the bipartisan infrastructure bill that you know, is being worked on as we speak, calls for that full funding, $3.5 billion. And so that's just an amazing result, and one that we hope will stick. And there's more to do, because there's more to the story than just that one division of the Indian Health Service, but it's a tremendous start. Senator Lujan from New Mexico had introduced a similar bill. I want to give credit to him as well. There are a number of Western senators and others who recognize this racial injustice that we have, and the federal trust responsibility to Indian tribes to solve that problem. So we're making progress, and hopefully that will continue.
I really appreciate that, Ann, and I think the work you're doing there and others are doing is so important to fixing some extremely awful historic inequities that I really appreciate it. And it's great to hear the way that good science can drive good policy. And I think that's something that is really important for everybody in the Colorado River Basin to hear and understand. I think your use of data and that group's use of data to drive the conversation has been really effective, and I applaud that. I think we've seen lots of critiques of lack of good data and science in the Colorado River and our water use, and so it's good to see an application of data that actually really results, or hopefully will result in repairing some of these historic problems. Along the lines of good data, I wanted to ask Steve in particular about modeling data, right? So we, the Bureau of Reclamation, our districts throughout the 7 states and water conservation districts, conservancy districts, all have been spending a lot of time and effort trying to really understand this complex issue that Ann was talking about, which where the water comes from, where it goes, how you can predict it. So the modeling is just really critical. And one of the models that we rely on, and the Bureau of Reclamation relies on, is the CRSS model. As we go into discussions, negotiations about revising the coordinated reservoir operations in the Colorado River Basin, Steve, why is good modeling important in that situation? Why is that data important? And can you provide a little bit of some examples of where we might improve those models that we're using to end up with a more workable and actually accurate results in the river? So, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. And first, I too want to give a shout out to Ann and the work with tribes. I applaud all of her efforts. And sort of a tangent to the drinking water is the critical need to settle all the tribal water claims in the West, in the Colorado River Basin. I think it's going to be very difficult moving forward until we get that done. So yes, tribal, drinking water is important, but settlement of water claims by the tribes is also going to be important moving on. Andy, getting back to your question on modeling and modeling data, certainly models are important. They let us sort of provide different scenarios and look what may or may happen on the system moving forward. But they're only as good as the data we can provide the models to begin with. Obviously, the models that Reclamation runs today, they work really well at Powell, and it seems as you move upstream, you kind of lose, there's bigger errors, less skill in those models. And a lot of that's due just to not having enough data input into those models. I think one simple thing, although not cheap, is they use a lot of stream gauge data. We don't have a lot of good stream gauges on the tributaries in the upper basin. They tend to sit on the main stem, bigger rivers. But we know our tributaries is where we tend to have shortages. Putting in more stream gauges on some of those tributaries will help us account for those shortages and stream flows and understand and run the models better. Anything we can do relative to being able to better forecast snowpack and water supply coming off that snowpack will help us. And there's a lot of efforts using satellites and using aircraft to be doing that are ongoing right now, ASO and some other projects like that. So I think we're getting there, hugely important. And I think the last one, the consumptive use piece, I think several people know that the states and Bureau of Reclamation have been talking about consumptive use methodologies, which ones work, which ones don't, which ones should we use, because everybody does things a little different right now. Understanding that consumptive use piece is very important input to the models. There's a lot of ongoing work right now in a project called OpenET, sponsored by NASA, Desert Research Institute, some other folks, that really tries to pull the best methodologies of consumptive use modeling into one fold and lets you be able to look at all of them, compare them, and really pull out the best data. I think OpenET within 5 years will probably be the gold standard for consumptive use and will only provide benefits in our modeling and our forecasting efforts within the basin. So, a lot of data components there, but I think those are the three big pieces.
Steve, go ahead, Ann. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to add to that, first of all, to emphasize that we absolutely have to get the best possible data on consumptive use. In the lower basin, they can measure their deliveries out of Lake Mead, but in the upper basin, we have to estimate our consumptive use in order to figure out how we're impacting the system. And so we have to have the best possible data. I sure hope OpenET is the answer and that it's available soon. But we've also raised some other issues where data is important, like forest health that Steve mentioned. We don't know exactly what, fire mitigation and restoration of forests, how that impacts water supply.
Oh,
And
I
to be able
think
to do a cost benefit analysis. Yeah. We need to be measuring the water use on the tributaries, not just in the upper basin, but in the lower basin as well. We need to be able to shepherd water, and that requires measurement from the release point down to where we're trying to get it. And we're seeing that come up right now with the additional releases that are being made from the upstream reservoirs to shore up levels in Lake Powell. We don't know how much water's getting there. So there are data needs. And yeah, I think, maybe with the additional spending that is coming now, focusing on Western water, we'll be able to correct some of those deficiencies.
right.
And on the forest health thing or the watershed, there's a lot of good evidence on small scales that says we can do good. We don't know what that means when you really expand it on a larger scale. I think that's what we need. As far as your shepherding accounting issues, yeah, there's a big technical data piece there, but there's a huge legal policy component of that as well. We're trying to get through all those hurdles right now at the same time.
Yeah, I think that you both raised really good points. I think just hitting back, Ann, you hit on the need for tributary measurement of water in both the lower and the upper basin. From our perspective, there's a big black box down there on the Gila River that is a little less than transparent, and understanding that and understanding how much water is really being consumed down there and how that should be allocated under our interstate agreements is really a critical piece of bringing this river into balance. I also think data. Steve, you talk about forest health data and whether it might work on a small scale, but what do we know that it does to a water supply on the bigger river? Same thing can be said about our cloud seeding programs. There's some studies done that predict how much the water supply is bringing into the river systems, but frankly, we need some better science, some better data in that, some better measurement tools. It's a really hard one to get, but I think that if we're going to rely on those water supplementation programs, we have to know with greater certainty that we're actually increasing the water supply. So I do think there's some areas there in terms of data. Water consumption is really key to understanding the upper basin equation. And again, I can't stress enough having a platform that is capable of uniformly understanding consumption in specific elevations and locations and soil types and aspects of the types of crops. All of that's so critical to actually developing good policy. So, it's great that those efforts are going on. Given how quickly things are changing on the river, we do have to worry whether it will happen fast enough. I think, one of the things we really haven't focused on is demand management in the upper basin, and the upper basin agreed to study a system by which we would intentionally reduce conserved consumptive use and store it in the crisp reservoirs in a special account. And that's a hard concept to get your head around, and for a lot of our water users. It is a change in the social and political perspective of many of our water users to try to conserve that water instead of use it. But it also is there's technical issues associated with it. How do you get the water into Powell, right? And so, I mean, just last year we had a trial release by one of our front range Trans Mountain Diverter operations, and that runs the Homestake Reservoir up above. In Eagle County here, and that's on the Eagle River tributary to the Colorado, actually on Homestake Creek. They released about 1,600 acre feet in coordination with the Division of Water Resources to try to track it to the state line, and they did that about late August, early September last year. When you read the state's report on that, we really don't know how much of that water made it to the state line. Right, there's estimates of transit loss, which can be high depending on the temperatures outside and the volume of flow in the river. And if you're releasing a slug of water that big and you can't track it to the state line, what additional data points do we need? What additional tools should we be looking at and making sure that are there so that we can actually track those kind of reservoir releases? We're seeing the same thing Ann alluded to right now. One of those, again, going back to those drought contingency plan documents, our upper basin agreed to, with the Bureau, to reoperate the reservoirs, the upper crisp reservoirs, so Navajo, Blue Mesa, or the Aspinall unit in Powell, to drop water into Powell, or excuse me, and Flaming Gorge to drop water into Powell when 3525, that power elevation protection level, became at question. Well, our 24-month study in June says it's a real problem, says we run a serious risk of dropping below 3525 early next year. So the Bureau, through some emergency powers, has started dropping about 181,000 acre feet of water between now and December. But there doesn't seem to be any real effort to track that by the federal government, and there hasn't been interactions between the feds and our state regulators who are the ones who would have the ability to shepherd water and track it. And the idea that lack of coordination and lack of development of data is occurring is really frustrating to those of us who are trying to study demand management and understand if it's ever going to work. Because what we could find is that the water, if it's dropped at the bottom of the hydrograph in August and September during a really hot, dry year like this one, we may see tremendous loss of that water that never makes it down to Powell. The question is, how do we design a program where the water has a better chance of getting into Powell and sustaining the system? I view what's going on right now in that reservoir system as a real lost opportunity for all of us in the river to understand how water moves in that system. And it's not as simple as saying we release 181 acre feet up here and 181 acre feet magically appear hundreds of miles away in Lake Powell. It doesn't happen that way. And so how do you track it and make sure that really happens? So I think the data and the science, again, is so important. So I think you're both got great points. I want to turn a little bit. Speaking of science and data, that Utah State University put together a team to study alternative management paradigms for the Colorado River. And Ann, I'm just curious in terms of what do you think about that study, and maybe the high points of what our audience might take away from that study, and what it might bring to our need for some creative solutions. So
yeah, so this is a group of climate scientists, hydrologists, geomorphologists looking at possible future scenarios on the Colorado River in terms of supply and then different assumptions about demand, with the idea being that, again, we've got a water balance problem, trying to get a handle on how bad that is and what would be necessary in order to fix it. This is a study that came out in January, but it's gotten maybe even more attention over the last couple of months because there have been a number of briefings by some of the authors to various folks in the water community. So this is a complicated graph, but the basic idea is that they're looking at the combined storage in Lake Powell and Lake Mead. So that's what's on the vertical axis. So going from 5 million acre feet of storage to 25 million acre feet of storage. And that's both lakes combined. And then the various colors and lines are what happens to that storage over time, given different assumptions. And the assumptions are around usage in both the upper basin and the lower basin. So on a very simplistic level, when you see lines going down from left to right, that means that we're still in imbalance, that demand is exceeding supply. And when the lines straighten out, then the system is in balance again, although it might be at a very low level of combined storage. So you can see the bottom lines on this graph that's being shown right now are hovering around 5 million acre feet of combined storage in the two lakes. That's basically dead pool. Not quite, but real close. So these folks were looking at levels of usage in the upper basin and additional shortages being taken in the lower basin. And these graphs show what that looks like. This one that we're showing right now is based on the hydrology that we've been experiencing in the past 20 years. So, well, 2000 to 2018. So this is based on hydrology that has actually happened. If you go to the next slide, it shows hydrology based on some climate change scenarios. And Andy alluded to this in his opening remarks. We have pretty confident projections about increases in temperature, and we know that there is a corresponding decrease in flows according to various different increases in temperature. This hydrology in this slide is based on a relatively modest increase in temperature, and you can see by the slant of the graphs that there's basically no equilibrium reached under that scenario, even in some of the much more significant caps or reduced usage in the lower basin. So this study, and you can stop sharing the screen, this study was intended to give us some data to use in discussions around how we operate the river. There's very little in the way of recommendations. Their one recommendation is that using a combined storage number, looking at storage in both Lake Powell and Lake Mead would be a better marker than operating the reservoirs differently depending on their individual elevations. And the intent was, we don't have too much of a problem figuring out how to operate the system when we have great hydrology. So the intent of this study was to give us a more detailed picture of what scary hydrology looks like, so that we can think about the scenarios that we need to plan for, and have those contingencies built into our next set of operating guidelines.
And Ann, I think your point there, scary. Everybody, well, are you trying to scare people using scare tactics? And I would say, no. The climate change hydrology, climate change scenarios utilized in the Utah State University study, people need to understand are really reasonable to expect that they will occur. This is not. I don't view that as a scare tactic to understand what is likely to come our way as we see rising temperatures. And what's really important, regardless of political perspective or the partisan way in which climate change has been handled, we have to recognize that water security for all our water users, no matter where you live in the basin, no matter who you vote for or what your political leanings are, water security is absolutely critical. And so we've got to understand the science. We've got to understand where we're headed, so that we can then help design a system that is most likely to succeed in terms of keeping everybody at some level of water supply that will allow them to continue to coexist in the American Southwest as we live through this aridification. So we need in the water world to take it out of that partisan politics and really look at this as something that is a solution-oriented. How do we protect our communities and our way of life? And I think I want people to understand that that's really where a lot of this discussion is coming from. It's not about pointing at people and saying, hey, your use of water is incorrect and politically unacceptable. It's how do we all be part of that solution and understand it. So I think it's critical. I do want to just turn to Steve for a minute. The Utah State University has gotten some significant pushback from the states in the Upper Basin because of the perceived focus on caps, right? And Ann's slide showed that they studied a cap anywhere from 3 to 5 million acre feet. Our current use at 4 to 4.5 million acre feet is above some of the caps that are being suggested and advocated for. Steve, what do you think about those caps, and what do you think about the issues presented by those for the Upper Basin?
Well, generally to the Utah State report, there's been a lot of praise for it. There's been a lot of criticism. Those issues have been debated elsewhere. I think there's a lot of good information in there. Specific to the cap, I'll go back to something that we talked about earlier, is that the Upper Basin basically is self-regulated on a cap based on hydrology. We can use so much water that's provided to us every year by Mother Nature. I will be curious, this year being a very, very dry year, what the total Upper Basin consumptive use will be. Given how dry it's been, are we at, if we're averaging using 4 to 4.5, was this year a 3.5 million acre feet use? Is it a 3 million? I don't know the answer, but I'd really like to know what it is. So how it plays into those range of caps that without a law that tells us how much we're going to use, Mother Nature is telling us how much we have available to use.
Well, thank you. I have to say, you both have been really fascinating. And I could talk to both of you for hours here, and I've got all sorts of questions. I've tried to cover some of the questions that were in the chat. I didn't get to all of them, and I apologize to folks who I didn't. But I do just want to again thank our panelists, Ann Castle and Steve Wolf, for spending time with us talking about these incredibly weighty issues. I at least take a very optimistic perspective that we can come together and solve these really dire water supply questions and demand issues. But we have to do it in good faith and in open discussion. such as this. And I think it's important to bring these conversations out in public discussion and help everybody understand what's going on. So I really appreciate the work that both of you have done in the basin and continue to do. And I want to thank all of our attendees for hanging in there and listening to us jabber. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye all.
With that, we'll sign off. Thank you very much.